Carlin. I'm the Director of Strategic Studies and the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies, and I'm very excited to welcome Secretary of Defense Esper here today. 2 years ago, his predecessor, Secretary Mattis, stood on this stage and delivered the National Defense Strategy. Just over a year ago or so, the former CNO, Gary Roughead, and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Eric Edelman, stood on this stage and delivered the Independent National Defense Strategy Commission's views on the National Defense Strategy. And today we have the Secretary of Defense discussing the NDS at 2. How's it going, etc. While he needs no introduction, I do want to take a quick moment for the students in particular. Because when you read Secretary Esper's bio, it is astonishing to see the different spots in which he has thought about defense policy. He's thought about it in the military. He's thought about it in the think tank community. He's thought about it in the Congress. He's thought about it in industry. And oh, by the way, he got a PhD. So he has managed to sit in a number of different perches, and I think that is what has enabled him to be such a tremendously effective Secretary of Defense. So please join me in welcoming Secretary of Defense Esper. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Good morning, and thank you, Mara, for that kind introduction. Very gracious. Nice to be here at SAIS. By the way, how many students are here? Good. Well, your faculty told me that if you're here, you get a 10% boost in your GPA. Part of your homework grade, right? Is that fair? Yeah. Okay, good. Very well. Well, look, I want to thank SAIS and the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies for inviting me here today. It is really an honor and a privilege. A special thank you to SAIS Dean, Elliot Cohn, who I've known for many years, and to the Merrill Center's Associate Director, Paula Thornhill, for playing such an important role in training the national security leaders of tomorrow. That's all of you. Thank you very much. Just over 2 years ago, as Mara mentioned, in January of 2018, the National Defense Strategy was officially unveiled right here at SAIS. The creation of that strategy was a result of a collective recognition that the security landscape has fundamentally changed. Effectively preparing for the future would require a new approach to how we equip, posture, and employ military forces around the world. The NDS outlined the United States' plan to maintain competitive advantage in a new era of great power competition, where revisionist powers seek to rewrite the international's rules-based order and the norms of good behavior. Take China and Russia. Both countries have violated the sovereignty of their neighbors and routinely used coercive strategies against smaller states to gain strategic advantages. Beijing continues to perpetuate intellectual property theft while attempting to control the economic and security decisions of other nations through its Belt and Road investments. Meanwhile, Moscow has turned to hybrid warfare as a means to expand regional influence at the expense of law-abiding nations while also breaking treaty obligations and engaging in malicious cyber operations. We also face continued threats from rogue states like Iran and North Korea that require our constant vigilance. Our recent actions against the Iranian regime, for example, restored deterrence in the region and sent the message that the United States will not stand idly by when our troops and interests are threatened. The NDS prepares us to overcome these challenges through 3 major lines of effort. First, we are strengthening military readiness and investing in the modernization of a more lethal force. Second, we are building alliances and attracting new partners around the globe. And third, we are reforming the department for greater performance and accountability. As we mark this 2-year anniversary of the NDS, we are looking to the road ahead with a focus on irreversible implementation. To achieve our goals, it is critical that Congress provide us with predictable, timely, and sufficient defense budgets. Our past 3 annual budgets have enabled
being tasked with judging the president.
I guess the news came on.
Would be the most difficult.
I got preempted.
I was not wrong.
Our past 3 annual budgets have enabled us to begin rebuilding readiness and modernizing the force after years of funding shortfalls and continuing resolutions. But to stay on the right track, we will need more support from the Hill in the years ahead. In a matter of days, we will present to Congress our fiscal year 2021 request, which reflects our commitment to making and maintaining major changes that will implement the National Defense Strategy. This budget will allow us to invest in a more lethal force, to realign our mission and operations around the globe, and to ensure accountability for every taxpayer dollar. President Trump and congressional leadership have already made significant investments in the modernization of our armed forces, which advances our first line of effort. From fighter jets to naval vessels to each leg of the nuclear triad, we are making solid progress in boosting operational readiness and lethality. To maintain our competitive advantage in the face of tomorrow's threats, we have invested in technologies like artificial intelligence, 5G, hypersonics, and quantum physics. Through our new Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, we're pulling all of our data and putting the warfighter into the cloud. We're working alongside industry to test U.S. 5G technology at our military bases while we encourage the private sector to lead the way on alternatives to Huawei. We have also ramped up our long-term investment in hypersonic weapons with an additional $5 billion over the future years defense program, and we plan to deliver this capability years ahead of schedule. Meanwhile, we established the United States Space Command and bolstered our offensive and defensive cyberspace programs. We recently swore in the first Chief of Space Operations and are making great strides in standing up the United States Space Force. The creation of a new military service is not only a historic moment for our country, but also a new chapter for the Pentagon, as we recognize the urgency of U.S. dominance in every warfighting domain. But ultimately, readiness and lethality rely on more than just a new technology and organizational changes. To harness the full potential of our efforts, we must also modernize how we fight. Our budget request supports the development of a new joint warfighting concept, which includes all domain operations. This new doctrine will enable dynamic force employment, which is a new concept that keeps our military operationally unpredictable and therefore more lethal, flexible, adaptable. Our second line of effort capitalizes on a strategic advantage that our adversaries do not possess, a robust network of like-minded allies and partners. Across the world, we are strengthening our relationships with our traditional allies while growing new partnerships to help smaller states stand up to Chinese coercion. I personally have traveled to the Indo-Pacific region twice now as Defense Secretary and continue to build upon our relationships there with countries of all sizes. They recognize better than anyone the threats posed by a rising China, and they share our desire to uphold international norms and values. Together, we are working toward a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. We will continue to work by, with, and through our partners in other parts of the world as well, as we strengthen our transatlantic bonds with our European allies. A ready and capable NATO is vital to our collective security, and we are pleased to see member states increasing their investments to advance burden sharing. Last December, at the NATO leaders meeting in London, we met our goal of identifying 100% of the contributions for the NATO Readiness Initiative, the first ever. This plan provides the alliance with the capability to have 30 mechanized battalions, 30 combat vessels, and 30 air squadrons ready to fight in 30 days or less. Additionally, as President Trump noted during the State of the Union this week, the number of allies now meeting the 2% of GDP commitment has more than doubled. NATO members are contributing an additional $130 billion cumulatively in defense spending since 2016 and are projected to add over $400 billion by 2024. Their investments are especially important as the alliance considers expanding its train, advise, and assist mission in the Middle East, helping to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, which is a priority for all of us. Our ability to invest in these relationships and build our readiness relies on the success of our third major line of effort, that is reforming the Department for greater performance and accountability. At the end of last year, we completed our second department-wide audit, which was no small feat for the nation's largest employer. Nearly 3 million military and civilian personnel work for the DoD, operating on every continent, flying roughly 14,000 aircraft, and maintaining over 1,000 facilities around the world. Ongoing annual reviews of this expansive enterprise are necessary to keep us on track. After my confirmation as Secretary of Defense, we launched a new initiative called the Defense-wide Review, which was a historic step in freeing up time, money, and manpower to reinvest back into our top priorities. Over the course of 4 months, we examined $99 billion in appropriated resources across the fourth estate, which is comprised of roughly 50 DoD organizations outside of the military departments. Ultimately, this process generated well over $5 billion in savings. The majority of it came from reductions to legacy activities that don't adequately support the NDS requirements, as well as decreasing overhead and shedding lower priority programs. We also identified over $2 billion in activities to transfer to the military departments. These savings will be invested in cutting-edge innovation and warfighting requirements of our core missions, including a strong and reliable nuclear deterrent, missile defense, hypersonics, AI, secure 5G technologies, the Space Force, and responsive force readiness. Our reform effort also includes major changes to our internal management systems, many of which are remnants of the Cold War. We have integrated our leadership teams to achieve results more efficiently and effectively and altered our internal battle rhythm. We now have weekly meetings that bring together senior military and civilian leaders from across the force to discuss our progress on the NDS and maintain accountability for outcomes. Additionally, we are establishing a new governance model for the Fourth Estate, which the Chief Management Officer will lead. This will force tough trade-offs between these organizations and field activities rather than passing on cost growth to the services. I've also launched a review of combatant commands to identify opportunities to rebalance troops and resources in support of the NDS. We have focused thus far on AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM and will continue our way through all of the combatant commands over the succeeding months to scrutinize our missions, our tasks, our requirements, and our resources. As we continue to review our activities, structures, and operating systems, we ask Congress for their support. At the end of the day, the success of our reforms and our NDS priorities will rely heavily on their leadership, both for the 2021 authorization and appropriations bills and beyond. I'd also like to mention a personal priority of mine, that is the well-being of our service members and their families. These men and women are the backbone of our national security, and it is our duty to ensure they and their families are cared for so that they can focus on their mission. This means providing safe and affordable housing and improving access to quality child care for military families, particularly in the areas that are experiencing staffing shortages. And it means supporting professional development opportunities to help military spouses advance in their careers as well. The Department is addressing each of these areas to better attract and retain people who have made the U.S. military the greatest fighting force in the world. On the subject of people impacting change, let me end with the example of Paul H. Nitze, the namesake of this great institution. Nitze was a chief architect of the United States military strategy during the Cold War. You all know that well. He's often remembered for his advocacy of U.S. military investment to deter the Soviet Union's hegemonic ambitions. His urgent calls for the United States to foster a technological edge over its competitors created a legacy that is reflected in many of our priorities now, nearly 70 years later. As a champion of military might, Nitze often stirred controversy with his approach to policy. But he was a forward thinker, one who inspired future generations of policymakers and national security leaders to recognize the power of innovation and to break out of traditional bureaucracy in implementing a new vision. This is the kind of spirit that is fostered here at this school, at SAIS, and that I encourage across all of DoD. It is the kind of spirit that has prepared us for great power competition, for the development and deployment of new technologies, and for making the National Defense Strategy truly irreversible and undoubtedly successful in the years ahead. I look forward to your questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. We really appreciated hearing your thoughts. I'll offer a couple questions, and then I'm sure the students and alums have some as well. Since we are at a university, I have to start with a question about grading, though. What grade would you give NDS implementation? And I should note, we at SAIS are particularly difficult graders.
I didn't know you let students pick their own grades. I'm not going to grade myself. I'm going to leave that to you all. Sometimes you get too close to the problem. And so I just say this much. We have a lot of work to do. I said in the end about Nitze, and what he said is you have to be innovative. You have to think differently. You have to lead people to think differently, to kind of buck the system, to change the inertia, to think differently, get outside the box. And I think there are areas where I see bright spots, and there are areas that still need a lot of work. But I'm committed. I've always said my top priority in the building is implementing the NDS, and we've gone about that quite aggressively. I've been saying that since my nomination hearing. We had a senior leaders conference last fall where I sat down with all the commanders and civilian leaders, and we mapped out 10 broad areas with detailed objectives based on time and clear metrics to map out how we're going to implement the NDS over the next 2 years. And so I'm fully committed to that. You see it in my remarks, I think hopefully in my actions more importantly. And we're going to continue to keep pushing along. And as I sit down at events like this, or as I often do, meet with folks from think tanks, from industry and whatnot, I take in the feedback and I hear where we're doing well and where we need to do better. So I would like to hear from all of you. I'll let you grade me.
Great. Thank you. It is really extraordinary to hear the NDS acronym ad infinitum throughout the Pentagon, throughout Washington, overseas. I mean, it's a real, I think, testament to you and your predecessor that folks have internalized it. I'm hoping you can talk to us a little bit about numbers. You're trying to make some hard changes, as you noted, through COCOM reviews, through new governance models, and yet we are constantly hearing things like the Navy saying we need 355 ships. How are you going to be able to square those real challenges?
Well, it is, there are a lot of challenges, and we need to meet them all. You know, what we need to do is get a solid budget. I think in the years ahead, we're going to need to get back on a trajectory of 3 to 5% real growth annually, and to make sure that we can sustain those changes, because we're going through this period now. We're getting rid of the legacy of the Cold War and the last 18 years of low-intensity conflict, whether it's doctrinally or whether it is, of course, equipment. We need to make this transition to the future force, and that takes time and money and change and leadership and support from Congress and from institutions like this. And then we can tackle the bigger issues. We can talk later if you want about Navy and shipbuilding and particulars, but that's what we need to do. We need to just push hard, have a clear vision. I think the NDS, what Secretary Mattis gave us and his team at that time was a great document, a great vision, and we will continue to improve upon it over time. But it is a strategy that everybody is unified behind. It gets broad bipartisan support, and that's why my commitment is implementing. I found in both the private sector and public sector, when you sit around the table, a lot of people have good ideas. The challenge is always implementation. That's the challenge right there. And what you have to do is make sure people have clearly assigned tasks, suspenses and metrics, and hold them to it. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. That's terrific to hear. Could you tell us a little bit about the challenge posed by the Middle East? Of course, the NDS is trying to get at China and Russian great power competition, but there are questions of deterrence in the Middle East, trying to figure out how much is enough, how to satisfy the insatiable demands of that region.
Yeah, well, since we're citing previous Secretary of Defense, I'll paraphrase Secretary Rumsfeld. You deal with the world you have, not the world you want. And so the world I want, the world I have includes Iran, which has been the sponsor of malign activity throughout the Middle East now for 40 years since the revolution. The IRGC and all their proxies are all the way from Africa through the Middle East into Afghanistan for sure, and you can find them in all parts of the world. So, and they are testing us, and they are very active, and they are causing turmoil throughout the Middle East. So my challenge there is to make sure that we reassure our friends and allies that we continue the enduring defeat of ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. And number 3, that we deter Iranian bad behavior. And so I have to do that. At the same time, I want to do that with the right size force while I continue to make all these other changes that will require us, that lead us toward implementing the NDS, which puts China number 1 as our top strategic competitor, and number 2, Russia. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, too, that China and Russia are also in the Middle East. And so there's an element of competition there as well also that I have to pay close attention to.
Indeed. So You mentioned the Space Force, and increasingly we're hearing calls for a new Goldwater-Nichols or a new Key West agreement. Folks are saying, look, there's more domains we have to worry about. We've got new services, changes in the security environment. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think organization is or is not working, roles and missions? Do we kind of need to rethink the system, or is it largely right?
Those are good questions. Those are good questions for you all and many others to think about. At some time, it's worth me looking at, but I think right now things are working. I think any shortcomings are largely put on my plate. And again, I think we can get distracted by those. My focus is implement the NDS. Let's just get moving. I want to get to the point where we have, as I said, irreversible momentum, where just the whole wave of change sweeps over us, and everybody comes along for the ride, and we get to that point where we're facing the challenges we see in the future. I talk to people all the time, and I say, look, I know Iran is right here in front of us, and North Korea over here is right in front of us, and we have to deal with terrorists and all that. If we keep focusing on the near term, we will miss the long term, and we will fall irreversibly behind. Let's be clear, the Chinese have used at least the last 18 years while we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan to make enormous strides with regard to the professionalization of their force, modernizing their doctrine, building new capabilities, going after us asymmetrically. And by the way, I'd say they started that before that. They started, my war was the Gulf War, 1990-91. They started then. They saw what we did, what the United States military did using precision-guided munitions, satellites, you name it, and they studied us, and they've made great strides, and we've got to start paying attention, or else we will find ourselves where we won't be able to sustain our overmatch.
Absolutely, and obviously you're dealing with the challenge.
And just to be, not because we're seeking war, but we want to deter war. It's peace through strength. Keep the balance right, maintain you have sufficient deterrence so that we can continue to compete economically and not let it spill over into the military realm. I'm sorry.
Indeed. No, thank you. And as you're trying to do all of this, you had talked about this issue of the money.
Right.
And I'm curious to hear your thoughts where you see defense spending going over the coming years, and in particular, you have this compelling strategy, and I think an international security environment that is supporting it. How do you get Congress to actually take the steps necessary?
Well, the message I've been sending now for 2 years since I became Army Secretary in 2017 was to just try and shake people and say, look, we have what we have. There's not going to be any moment like when President Reagan came into office and you'll see defense budgets go through the roof in a peacetime environment. And so what that means is we have to get our minds fixed on that because the nation has larger fiscal challenges, whether it's the deficit, rising interest on the debt. We can talk about the growth of mandatory spending. We can go through all. That's a whole budget discussion. But we have to brace ourselves for the fact that at best, defense spending will be level. I want to get it to grow to inflation, as I said, 3 to 5% annually. But that means, really what it means is we have to dig deep and really have to look at ourselves. We should be able to we should be able to defend our great country with the amount of money we're given, and that means we're going to have to make tough choices, and I'm prepared to make the tough choices, and that's where I need Congress's support. There's a lot of talk all the time about reform, and we need to reform and do things differently. I'm going to put things on Congress's plate next week and in the succeeding weeks and months, and it's going to be time to help me make tough choices. But that's what it's going to take if we're going to, again, either shed legacy things or make the hard calls with important but lower priority programs that just don't stand the test when you look at what we need to do with regard to hypersonics or AI or 5G.
Absolutely. And in that vein, do you think the department will be able to try to kind of leapfrog Russia and China in those sorts of kind of key technologies?
The leapfrog suggests we're behind, and I think we're ahead in many, many areas, and I think the key is to sustain that overmatch and grow it over time. I've said, particularly with technologies like AI, I think whoever gets there first and can implement it, implementation is key, and get it throughout the force, I think you'll have you could likely change the character of war for some time to come for many years, and I think it's important to get there first.
Absolutely. Do you think the department needs any new authorities or tools in that regard, or generally it's got, it's in a pretty decent place?
There are things at the margin that we will ask for in terms of reform and some other stuff like that, but generally the challenge is on us. It's a leadership challenge. It's a cultural challenge to kind of get beyond, again, think about the future, don't think about the present, and be willing to get outside the box and make tough choices.
No
and
doubt.
that's tough for us as human beings. Most people aren't inclined that way.
Indeed, and you have the headlines, of course, that make your job a whole lot harder, no doubt. Let me ask you one more question, and then I look forward to turning the folks in the audience. Could you tell us how you assess the civil-military balance in the Pentagon? How are things along those lines?
How do you, tell me how you define a civil-military balance, because people define it different ways.
Well, one could look at it obviously vis-a-vis Congress or vis-a-vis the White House, but I was just thinking inside the department.
Yeah, so that's one way that I think about it is too. So what I've tried to do when I came in really is to integrate the civilian and military side of things. When I was Army Secretary, we'd have meetings just with the civilians, and then the uniformed guys would have their meetings, and the chiefs would have their meetings. And what I did on week one was to really say on Mondays, we're going to have 2 sets of meetings. We're all going to get together and we're going to cover weekly priorities review. So what I do is go over a set of issues quarterly that are top of mind for me, whether it's development of or modernization of the force. I look at people issues. I look at other things like reform of Defense Health Agency. And on the afternoons, what we do is we look at NDS implementation. And we review war plan development, op plan development with regard to China, Russia, things like that. And we all sit together as a joint uniform and civilian team. That's number one. Number two, I've put policy, our policy folks, right in the middle of all those planning with regard to the joint staff. So we much better bonding between the joint staff. And I'm always very conscious when I'm in tough times to make sure that we have our civilian and military leadership at the table. So in the moments about a month ago when we were facing off with Iran, many times I sat nearly all the time with both my military and civilian leaders there to help provide advice and input and weigh things out, because I think together the more minds you put at the table, the better, and it also certainly improves coordination between whether it's the services and the commands, the joint staff and the OSD staff, or just the uniform side and the civilian side. I think it's important to keep building those relationships.
Absolutely, that's tremendous to hear. You know, we've had alums like the former Deputy Secretary Bob Work or the current Commandant of the Marine Corps, Dave Berger. So their successors are sitting in this audience,
Good.
And I suspect they like hearing that.
Right.
Let me turn to the audience now for some questions. Please raise your hand. We have folks coming around with mics. There's one all the way in the back. And please introduce yourself.
With the budget and the forces that you have available, is it going to be necessary to draw back, to slow down on operational tempo demands on the people and equipment to buy space for modernization and reinvesting and implementing the NDS? And if so, how's that going?
The short answer is yes, and not just for those reasons. I want to slow the op tempo down some so that we can make sure that we're not running our people into the ground. And not just our active duty forces, but maybe more importantly, our reserve component forces. So some of you may know from my bio, I served 21 years, 10 on active duty, but 11 in the Guard and Reserve. So I have a special appreciation for what it means for a guardsman or reservist to have to leave home, come back, leave your employer. And it's particularly tough on those what we call Compo 2 and Compo 3. But so that's one facet. The other facet is slow down the pace, slow down the COCOM demand, if you will. So that troops, units, et cetera, have more time at home to train and prepare for future conflict, again, against either China or Russia. And then third is the whole budget piece of that. I mean, operations drive our O&M costs. So I'm very conscious of that, but I got to get it all back into a balance that is sustainable over the long term, again, for people, for equipment, for our own future modernization.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, Ali up in front.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I probably don't. My name is Ali Awadallah. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. So I wanted to ask, we hear a lot about great power competition in the Middle East and in the Asia Pacific with Russia and China. What I hear much less about is competing with them in other regions like Latin America, like Africa. I'm curious if you think that we should be paying more attention to those regions and why we don't discuss that as often in the Washington, D.C. and security space.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, we should, and I will tell you we are. I'm paying very close attention to you. As I said in my opening remarks, I'm going to do reviews of all the combatant commands, not just the geographic, but the functional, to make sure that we're thoroughly aligned with the National Defense Strategy. And as I've gone through both AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM, both areas where we see Russian and Chinese presence, I'm asking ourselves, I'm asking the commanders, your number one thing is I want to make sure you're paying attention to your war plans and contingency plans. But next is great power competition. And so I'm trying to reorder that. People might say that in Southcom, number one is counter-drug, and in AFRICOM, it's counter-terrorism. What I'm trying to do is move up great power competition to make sure that we're competing at the right places with the right people against the Russians and Chinese to make sure that we're holding on to key terrain, if you will. Now, both those theaters in particular are places where it's not just a military. In fact, I would argue you need more of a whole government approach, particularly in Africa, we could leverage, I think we should leverage AID, a lot of State Department functions, a whole of government approach to really compete more effectively against the Russians and Chinese. I need to get my own house in order first. I mean, our folks there are doing a great job, but I want to fine-tune that so that I'm focused on the NDS, and if I can free up resources, I will do that to get back to that gentleman's question just before yours. And then we got to build it out so that we take a full interagency approach to this.
It seems, if I could just add to Leah's great question, that the COCOM commanders often ask for so much because they feel the risk themselves, like it's on their shoulders. Is there anything you can do to help alleviate that?
Well, sure. What we have to do is, and what we've begun, is scoping down the tasks and requirements. So one of the things that the Joint Staff has done very effectively is to look at what are the tasks required of these COCOMs and what has built up over 15, 20, 25 years. It is in the hundreds. And so we're going through those and trimming them down and making sure we ask ourselves, is this still relevant today? If it's relevant, is it still a high enough priority task? And that way I can scope that mission down to something that is far, far more appropriate. And then, of course, the tough choices, at the end of the day, I bear the risk. I own the risk. And that's how we're trying to calibrate. That's how the building works, and that's how the commands work, and we have to get that right.
Thank you for stating that. Yes, Brendan.
Sir, my name is Brandon Patrick. I'm a strat student here also. I think that, going back to the Middle East for a moment, the strike on Qasem Soleimani, I think, caught a lot of us here by surprise when that happened. You know, as far as the level of the escalation there, you know, Qasem Soleimani was one of those few unifying figures within Iran. What was the strategic benefit, the long-term strategic benefit in striking?
Well, the long-term strategic benefit is we took off the playing field, the battlefield, and he was on the battlefield as a battlefield commander, one of their most effective commanders, somebody who was a terrorist leader of a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization who had the blood of hundreds of Americans on his hands over many, many years. By the way, he had the blood of hundreds of other people around the world on his hands too, including the Iranian people. And so it was an easy decision for me to make that, as it was for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Again, he had the blood of Americans on his hand as recently as, I think, the attack of December 27th that the IRGC was behind, and he was actively planning a next attack. And so I think taking him off the field, a battlefield leader off the battlefield, was a good response to Iranian bad behavior and his personal actions over many, many years.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a loud voice. I can project it. That's fine. Sir, it's an honor to meet you. My name is Sandra Salvatore. I'm president of the inaugural DIA cohort, which is the Doctor of International Affairs. And my thesis happens to be...
I was thinking of another DIA, sorry.
Well, I happen to have experience in that area. But actually, my thesis happens to be trying to define the whole government approach. So I appreciate the fact that you brought that up, because I am also a reservist, and when I was deployed to Horn of Africa, that's where it really came up for me.
Sure.
And I was an AFRICOM, I helped stand up AFRICOM as well, so I appreciate that, and I hope there's an opportunity to interview you as part of my dissertation. But my question is, my question is, the reality of trying to change and innovate the Department of Defense. We have in our cadre of 15s and SESs people who have a lot of experience but may not be the right fit for where we're trying to go. And I was curious what levers do you feel that you have available to you, or that you feel like you need in order to get to where you want to go?
Yeah, well, not everyone is an innovator. We're all built differently, and you have to be not only an innovator, but you have to be willing to be a disruptor. And so not all people are built that way. So I think you got to find those innovators and disruptors, and you got to empower them. You got to bring them up through the ranks, right? We got to do that in the military side. That was something I focused on as Secretary of the Army. You got to reward those people and kind of protect them And then you get you get that group of people. Then you got the people who just won't get there, and you gotta pull them along. And if you can't pull them along, then maybe they need to find another occupation. And then you get the fence sitters. And what you got to do is really win over the fence sitters and convince them that look at the benefits. And sometimes it's kind of deferred. It's a deferred benefit, right? It's something that takes time to see. It's it's putting money in a bank. And so you just have to bring those groups around as carefully as possible and as smartly as possible, but as quickly as possible, because otherwise the bureaucracy will just swallow you up. And the thing is, I tell folks, just keep moving forward. Just keep moving forward. I was an infantry officer. It's what we tell soldiers. Just keep moving forward. Don't stop. When you stop, you're dead. It's, get off the beach, right? Keep going. And so you gotta keep doing it. You gotta be conscious of what's coming up. You can't let the you can't let the naysayers drag you down. And so that's the challenge. Just keep pushing forward. And that's what I tell people. But you gotta find the leaders out there, both the formal and informal leaders who can help get you there. And as we did the defense-wide review over 3.5 months, I sat through 20-some sessions. You could tell in a heartbeat the folks who came up and said, this is my organization, this is my mission, but I can do it better. Here are the things I'm willing to do differently. And in a couple cases, I had folks say, look, I can find 8% in savings. I'm willing to give it to you now, Mr. Secretary, but what I'd like to really do is let you give me money back. Give me some of that back and I'll put it here. And that's an easy decision for me, go for it. And you got to reward those people too. Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Hi there, Gregory Kist, Strat Sydney here as well. You've talked a bit about great power competition with Russia and China, and I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how the department plans to respond to gray zone threats emanating from those countries.
What threats?
Gray zone threats. So like Russia's use of the Wagner Group mercenaries or China's use of civilian vessels to harass Navy ships in the South China Sea.
Yeah, so we have a variety of means to do that as well. We do through information ops. We challenge them. Oftentimes we've done this before. We would just outright ask them, are these your forces? And if they say no, then we know what we can do and what we can't do. And so we can use our own type of gray tactics, asymmetrical tactics. So I think we've learned a lot. The Russians did some great innovation on that when it came to Ukraine and other places. So we have to be more aggressive on that front. I think, again, building out our partnerships with allies and others. We're doing a good deal of that in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. I've spent a lot of time with our partners out there to talk about, like you said, whether it's use of the maritime militia by the Chinese and others, is how do we band together and stand up? You also have to use, the things we do in the international space. Can you come up with a code of conduct that most countries can agree to that sets a new norm? And there are things like that where you got to box them in so we get these countries to start behaving like normal countries and obeying the international rules-based order. Not that we shouldn't look at the rules-based order and ask ourselves, is it right for the time? We should always do that. But when you're openly not only challenging it, but flaunting it, ignoring it, breaking it, that's when we have problems.
Thank you. Yes, up here.
Either one. Go ahead.
You can even do both.
You both.
Mr. Secretary of Defense, you mentioned alliances and also the NATO leaders meeting. I was very lucky to participate at a NATO Engages conference in London, and I would say one area where the leaders managed to break the ground this year was on China. And indeed, China is, there is a reference in the NATO London Declaration on China. I was wondering from a US perspective, how would you assess or how should NATO adapt to China's strategic competition? And the second question, in the context of Brexit, how would you assess the UK global repositioning, particularly on the transatlantic dimension, and what kind of partnership is the US envisaging? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood all of the second question. I'll just say we continue our special relationship with the UK. It's very close. I've met many times with my counterpart. He's a good man and a very capable defense minister, and we just continue to build those ties between us, and I talk a lot to them. On the first question, with regard to NATO, you're right. We've come a long way. I've been to 3 or 4 NATO defense ministerials now, in my role. I go again next week, I think. And in each time we talk about China. It's something that many of us have come late to understanding, even in this country. I think it's only been the last few years that we've kind of all woken up and realized what's going on. And a lot of that has been driven by the new leader, not the new leader, but President Xi, who's taken the country in a very different direction than where it was. And so I think folks are waking up to that, have in this country for the most part, but in Europe it's a little bit harder, and they're a little bit behind us there. Some countries, some NATO allies are there already, others are further behind. So it's a continuous engagement. I will talk about it again next week in Europe. But again, I think the more that we as an alliance can talk about the challenges that Russia and China, obviously Russia is much closer to the NATO alliance, but China as well, pose to, again, the international rules-based order, all the things we value, our shared interests. I think many countries get it, and I think it helps us in terms of standing up to the Chinese and not buying into their, Belt and Road strategy that ends up being a debt trap for some countries, or Huawei, which threatens our networks that could really impede the alliance in terms of intelligence sharing or doing operational planning. So I think it's all coming along. We continue to have that dialogue, and I think we're moving in the right direction for the most part.
Thank you. Yes, and back.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. My name's Sean Gibbons, and you spoke a lot about today so far about efficiency and streamlining, and I was wondering, what are some, how do you combat sort of institutional and congressional constituencies for things like, say, the F-15 or other platforms that have sort of inbuilt pressures to kind of perpetuate themselves as opposed to moving on to newer platforms like the F-35? How do you kind of navigate those pressures?
Well, I've yet to find a program that doesn't have a constituency somewhere in D.C. If you can find it, let me know, because I'll either boost it or kill it. But I try and be very clear as I can. I've been speaking about implementing the NDS for some time now. I did it in the Army, and very clear that I'm willing to make tough choices and cut programs or reduce programs. And I try and be transparent with members of Congress and be very forthright in what we're doing and why. That doesn't mean it doesn't guarantee you smooth sailing, but there are a core group of members up there, particularly on the defense committees, that recognize that we need to do better. We need to make changes. We need to be more efficient. And they are great supporters, great anchors. They also give us good advice. And so relying on them to help us is also critical. And that's a bipartisan group, by the way. So I think it's leaning on folks like that to help other members get over the humps, the hurdles as we put things up that may be important to them or that they feel strongly about. And many times they're getting bad information from others, or they're reading about things in the paper that's not accurate. And so again, it just has to be transparent, informational, provide the facts. I have a very clear agenda. I'm trying to implement the National Defense Strategy in a world where I have fixed, relatively fixed budget. I have fixed number of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. I got a fixed number of platforms, et cetera. I can't do everything, and you got to make tough choices. You got to prioritize.
Thank you. Yes, up here.
Thank you, Secretary. Henry Newsom, I think it's recent. It's about 10 or 12 years ago. Strategic Studies alumnus. Inside the Beltway, the coin of the realm has changed from counterinsurgency to great power competition over the past few years. It is undoubtedly prudent to be prepared for a large-scale conflict with China or Russia, and the business that I run is invested in that challenge. Regardless, someday American forces will fight and suffer hundreds or thousands of casualties in a short period. Is that future conflict more likely to be against a great power or an insurgency?
Well, I don't see conflict as inevitable. So I think what we're trying to do is avoid conflict. And I think, again, you avoid conflict by being strong enough to deter one. And I think it's in our interest, Russia's interest, China's interest. I don't think any of us are seeking conflict per se. So we try and lead and manage very carefully. When you pose it against on the counterterrorism side, I don't see a counterterrorism conflict resulting in hundreds of thousands. I think that's the number you gave. I think hundreds or thousands. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I think terrorism is going to be with us for the rest of my natural life. It's going to be a generational conflict until we solve its roots, whether they are cultural, religious, economic, whatever the case may be. And that's where I think it requires a whole of government and a multilateral approach. So what the NDS says, the NDS is not exclusive with regard to Russia and China. It's very broad. It says your first priorities will be China, then Russia. Then second, you got to deal with the rogue states, if you will, Iran, North Korea, and others like them. And it says we have to continue to have a capability and to deal with violent extremist organizations. And so my challenge, and I think we do it very well, particularly through our special operation forces, but all, is to balance all those three out so that we can continue to avoid the next 9/11, God forbid, or something like that. And so that's part of what I'm doing right now, is to make sure the force is properly manned and trained, equipped, resourced, et cetera, along all those three areas, with the priority being the first, right, great power competition, so that we don't find ourselves in something that you described.
And would you say, Mr. Secretary, that China and Russia are largely deterred today?
Well, I think so. I mean, none of us want conflict. I speak to my counterparts in China and Russia. It's part of what I'm trying to do, make sure we have clear lines of communication to avoid misunderstanding, to avoid miscalculation, whatever. And they're always very civil discussions, and we lay out our interests. But I don't think anybody wants conflict. I think, again, the more we can keep our competition in the economic realm, the better. But countries have their interests too, and ours is defending this rules-based order. It's defending freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce. It's defending human rights, religious freedom, freedom of the press, et cetera. So we got to balance all those things out, and again, hopefully we can keep it restricted to the economic realm or the political realm, and it doesn't spill over into a military one, because that would not be good for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yes, over here.
Good morning. My name is Lansdale Henderson. I'm a recent graduate of the Global History program. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for speaking this morning and for your service. My question has to do with European leadership related to her question in global power, great power competition. And you'd mentioned the priority of robust alliances, restructuring AFRICOM, where France has a strong counterterrorism presence, NATO spending, and in particular great power competition. So my question is, post-Brexit, does the United States need a special relationship within the European Union? And if so, who and why?
Yeah, so we have a lot of relationships with countries in the EU. I know the head of the EU. She's very capable. I've gotten to know her. And obviously many NATO allies and partners are in the EU as well. And what we also try to do at our NATO defense ministerials is we often have a dinner where we all get together with members of the EU as well, countries and the head of EU. So there's a very good dialogue going on. EU is obviously, with regard to the European countries, central to what they do. In many ways, we need the EU's help to improve the infrastructure in the countries of many of our NATO allies, because we need them to build help improve the road network, the rail network, bridges, et cetera, to facilitate our lines of communication, our movement of troops and flights and whatnot. So having that relationship and that communication with the EU is very important, and we work with them. And again, we have countries who are very close to us, who are either NATO allies and are in the EU that help. And we also have countries who are in the EU but not NATO allies, who we do a lot of, we engage a lot with, who are very helpful as well.
Thank you for that. Yes, there's a question over here. Shay?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'm Shay Kitiri, second-year strategic studies student. We're at the birthplace of Supreme Command here, and there are many vacancies from the rank of undersecretary below, all the way below. And my question is, does that undermine civilian authority and make implementation of the NDS more difficult? And why are there so many vacancies?
I'm sorry, does what undermine civilian authority?
Vacancies in civilian positions from undersecretary, assistant secretary positions and below.
Yeah, I think that's overstated. It becomes a theme at times for different departments. I think we have 50, 60 Senate confirmed positions, and I think only a dozen or so are unfilled. And those that are unfilled, I think most of those are somewhere either on the Hill or being vetted through the White House. I've worked in the Pentagon 4 or 5 times now, going all the way back to 1994. You probably weren't even born then. I will tell you that vacancies in DoD are a common thing. It happens all the time. They're tough, demanding jobs. Anybody here work at DoD? I mean, they're tough jobs. I mean, it's the only place where somebody says the meeting tomorrow is at 7, and you have to say AM or PM. So we burn people out pretty quickly, and it is a high threshold to come in because you are entrusted with national security issues. You're giving us, not giving you, but you're vetted for a security clearance, and we entrust you to do a lot of hard work and put your heart and soul into it. So vacancies are not a new thing. We stay on top of it. We manage it. One of the things you do in these roles, or you always make sure that the people you pick are very capable, or you have some who are very capable of escalating up into an acting role, and we have very good acting folks doing that now. But this is just the nature of doing business. It was the same way in the private sector. When I was in the private sector, we would have vacancies, fewer of them, because you can hire people more quickly. There was a larger pool of talent out there, if you will, to draw from. It's not. I have no doubt that we can continue to conduct our mission, execute it faithfully, and do what we need to do. And there's no doubt between the uniformed and the civilians that civilian control of the military is something, as a tradition, a practice, an institutional thing going back, generations. So there's no doubt in my mind about any of that.
Thank you. Right up here.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. My name is Rob Wilson. I'm a first-year American Foreign Policy student. And my question for you is regarding Afghanistan. I'm wondering if you could discuss where you see U.S. strategy in Afghanistan the next 5-10 years.
In Afghanistan?
Afghanistan.
I think it's very simple. Is we want to make sure that Afghanistan never again becomes a place from which terrorist groups can launch an attack against the United States. I mean, that's the end state I'm trying to achieve. And I think our military, our diplomatic corps, our other parts of government have done a great job. Knock wood, we haven't seen that since 9/11, and that's the mission for me, period.
Thank you. There's a question right up here.
Chris Grawl, current Strat student. So you mentioned certain reforms the department is making, yet bureaucracies are notoriously resistant to change. I was wondering if you could share some of the examples of resistance that you've encountered to implementing the NDS and how you've overcome that resistance.
Nice easy question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to call anybody out. It's fair to say that nearly any change requires some resistance, period. I mean, again, it's like every program has a constituency, and often the constituency begins with those who work on it. And so that's tough. And what you got to promise people, again, that this is the path forward, this is what we're trying to achieve. It's not going to affect, in most cases, nearly all cases, it's not going to affect your livelihood, but you got to get people off the dime to do things differently. And you can look, in the Army, we proposed to cut or reduce, I think, I'm forgetting the numbers now, maybe 186 programs. And we were able to pull off nearly at least 185, and I think 186 is pending. So I think change is hard, but I think with the right commitment, the right leadership, you have to have a good leadership team. And we have that. We had that too, is critical. But look, everything, you couldn't bring 5 people together and get them all to agree on something without somebody saying they object, or you just got to work your way through that. So it just requires leadership, and sometimes it's collective leadership, sometimes it's personal leadership, and oftentimes you just got to ignore the naysayers and just keep moving forward.
Thank you. We'll take one final question in back.
Hi, sir. Chris Bowen. I'm a SICE alum and former infantryman. We talk a lot about lethality. It's one of the overarching themes of the NDS and as the #1 LOE within the department. Technologically, increasing said lethality is kind of, we've pursued that through the modernization priorities. From an operational and a joint force perspective, one of the initiatives that you've pursued is the establishment of the Close Combat Lethality Task Force. Can you comment on the status of the task force and its future?
Yeah, the task force is still up and running. I had a chance to visit with them, I think in December, to take some time to walk around, find out how they're doing, talk to them about issues. It's a task force that's near and dear to my heart as a former infantryman myself. So It's something I want to preserve. What we're going to do probably is transition it to the Army, because something like that needs a strong foundation, a backbone upon which its ideas can then filter out. The Army obviously provides the largest share of infantry, if you will, infantry and special operators. So nesting it right there, Secretary McCarthy's a big believer in it too, will allow it to more quickly get its ideas and innovations out into the field. And so we've leveraged it fairly well. I think we can continue to work on it and do better. But I do think that's something we need to continue to invest in your average infantryman, your special operator, those folks on the ground. Those are the folks that do most of the fighting and suffer most of the casualties. And we've got to keep advancing either their, improving their tactics, the technologies, the personal protective equipment, weapons, et cetera, so that person to person on the battlefield, we have a distinct advantage. But I'd say at the end of the day, and I thought this is where you're going, yes, technology is a factor, but it's the people we recruit, and it's the people we train, I think makes all the difference. And the fact that we train jointly together is what's going to separate the American soldier or American Marine on the battlefield against any of his or her peers. And that's the key part that we need to keep developing, is the individual soldier, Marine, special operator, you name it, the NCO Corps, which is the backbone of our military, and then, of course, the people, the leadership above them, the officer corps above them. So to me, that's the game changer right there, and always will be.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being so generous with your time and your insights. Good. Please join me in thanking him. Thank you. It's a coin from the school. Thank you so much. We've got you slated to exit out this way, so I'll take you out. Please stay in your seats. Thank you.